Her eyes were closed but a light as bright as the sun was shining through them. She opened them and looked up towards the ceiling light. Someone had put on the light in their dorm room and panic gripped Claire. The last time that they had put on a light after 10 she had to sweep the entire cafeteria during breakfast and the morning rush of students. She wasn't a pupil at this institution, she was a governess. She took the first job she was offered in a new country. She was assigned a room with 3 other governesses in the boarding home, and just like the rest of the boarding house, their lights needed to be off by 10. Miriam, her roommate, had a lantern that she would light when the lights went out and they would use its dim light to get ready for bed once the lights were out. Sometimes Claire would read near the dim light of the lantern. It was a beautiful thing. The black and white pages would turn golden and lively near Miriam's lantern. She lived for those nights, when she could read newspaper articles and not have to clean up after children. They would go to town to deliver laundry every few weeks and Claire loved to put a handful of coins together and buy the latest newspapers. 1921 had been an eventful year and the papers always sold out. Now someone had switched the light on after 10 and everyone had the same puzzled and almost frightened looks on their faces. "What are you doing, Ashley? We could get a disciplinary warning for that," whispered Miriam, trying her hardest not to make noise or alert any attention to their room. "It's too late for anyone to notice. Besides, with all the money that Cunningham has been stealing from the school, a high electrical bill is the least of their concerns," replied Ashley as she retrieved something from the top of her cupboard. She put the light out after a while and went to bed. She had taken out an extra jersey since it had begun to get colder. The alarm of the light going on in the dead of night began to wear away and the ladies were falling asleep. Cunningham was the headmaster of the school and always involved in some kind of illegal activity. Once he had the police show up at the school to arrest a drug dealer at his house. How he got there was anyone's guess. He would never get arrested though, until this day, no one knew who had tipped the police off about that. Besides his dodgy dealings, he continued to be the headmaster of the school since his family owned the place. Some said he was related to the Queen of Spain but others said his grandfather was merely a gambler who got lucky in the 80s. As soon as the bell rang in the morning, the pupils were off to the showers and the ladies to the kitchens. Claire always thought that having oats for breakfast was a bad idea. With students being allowed 3 spoons of sugar, it would only be a while before the chatter and malice began. Prefects did their best to quiet the children but that didn't seem to work. The cafeteria was the only place where male and female students met or were allowed to interact with one another. Apart from the few brave souls who would sneak out of their dorms to be with their lovers, male and female contact was strictly forbidden. This rule had never been adhered to since at least 3 girls a year would be expelled for getting pregnant. Claire had to drop some of the students' laundry off that afternoon so she left to do that after breakfast. Ashley went along with her to help carry the piles of laundry. "I don't know how long the school has had this old truck. Do you think we'll make it?" asked Ashley as Claire drove at a very sluggish pace. "I doubt it would break along the way. If it does we'd have to sleep inside the truck. I think it's going to rain," replied Claire, looking at the thick clouds ahead of them. "Who on earth is that?" asked Claire as an unfamiliar man walked towards the boarding home with a suitcase over his shoulder. "That's the new gardener. Either that, or he has tragically lost his direction," replied Ashley as she turned to watch the man. "Gardener? What happened to Mr. Winslow?" asked Claire. "He kicked the bucket last month. Only 5 people showed up to his funeral, apparently," replied Ashley. "I'm guessing you weren't one of them," added Claire as she drove through the wet roads. "Nope, hardly noticed he was gone. Seems like it's been raining in town this autumn," replied Ashley. Once they got to the laundromat they had real work unloading all the clothes they had to drop off that day. "Right, come pick 'em up on Friday and that would be £1.50 as usual," said the thin lady at the reception in a very high pitch. Ashley paid the lady and they were off, back to the boarding home, hoping to get there in time for lunch. Claire saw the new gardener again as they walked to the dining hall. He didn't seem to be well dressed at all. He wore a very old grey coat as he walked through the school gardens, inspecting the wilted roses along the path. "Come along, Claire, children need to eat," said the soft voice of Miriam as she nudged Claire along. Claire quickly turned her gaze to the dining hall and ran after Miriam, hoping that she wasn't too late. She hardly noticed what a long time she had spent pondering the new gardener. Perhaps because of her unfamiliarity with strangers she found him so interesting. Seeing the same faces for so long, a few first-year students and a new gardener was something of interest to her. That afternoon as Claire was ironing the curtains she saw the gardener again. He was tiling the ground for what would be a very large garden. Before then, flowers were only grown at the front of the school and near the boarding home for decoration. Perhaps he would grow apple trees and daisies. Her mind was filled with all the possibilities of what the new school garden would look like. She switched off the iron and folded the last curtain onto the pile. Claire thought she'd familiarize herself with the new gardener before she continued her daily chores. Walking up to the gardens, she stood by the fence and casually waved at the gardener, a tall blonde man. "How do you do, sir? My name is Claire, I'm a governess at this school," she yelled over to him as she waved. He stopped what he was doing and took in the lady that was speaking to him. He began to walk towards her and took off his cap as he greeted her. "Nice to meet you, Miss Claire, the governess. My name is Mr. Appleton, your new gardener," he said as he brushed off his hand on the side of his dusty grey overall. He put forth his hand to shake hers and she confidently shook it. Such cordiality was very uncommon for Claire since her position in society meant that no one had ever formally introduced themselves to her with a handshake. "How long do you plan to work here?" she asked, not sure why that would be of any interest to her. "As long as I can, ma'am. Work this good is not easy to find," he replied, seemingly pleased with himself for having received the humble job of a gardener. Claire understood how scarce good work was, but imagined someone as comely as Mr. Appleton to have a job in showbiz, not at a secluded place like that. Soon the bell rang for dining hall and Claire remembered the curtains she had finished ironing earlier. "I must be off, see you tomorrow," Claire yelled as she ran towards the boarding home. She hung the curtains with Leandra, one of her roommates. The children dished up as Claire stood on a chair attaching the curtains that Leandra was handing her. "Cunningham sold half the benches that the school owns, heard about it today," said Leandra as she passed Claire another curtain. "What? Are 3 students going to share a bench during school hours?" exclaimed Claire at the news that was given her. Apparently they were about to close the electrical. "The bill was too high this month," continued Leandra. "Isn't the amount of tuition these children pay enough to cover those bills?" asked Claire as she hung the curtains. "How do you think he was going to pay for that vacation he had in Ireland last month?" asked Leandra, laughing as she did. They walked over to the other side of the room once they were done hanging the curtains on that side of the room. "What if we had our own fundraising campaign for the school?" asked Claire as Leandra handed her another curtain. "Whatever do you mean, Claire?" asked Leandra, not sure if such a thing would be possible with their busy schedules. "We could bake cupcakes in the kitchen, at night when everyone's asleep. Then you could sell them in the marketplace whenever you have an occasion of going to town. Like this Friday, I have to pick up the laundry. We could sell them then," explained Claire, the excitement of the idea putting a broad smile on her face. Leandra loved the idea, nodding her head in agreement. The money they'd make from selling cupcakes at town would probably be a joke compared to how much Mr. Cunningham was taking from the school. For Claire, the thought of baking cupcakes in the middle of the night and going to the markets in town was such a pleasant one. A change from the boring life of a governess. For the next few days Claire and Leandra would go to the kitchen at night and bake cupcakes to raise funds for the school. When Friday came she drove to town with Ashley, very early in the morning. Claire was filled with the excitement of being able to intermingle with the people in town, even if all she did was sell them a few cupcakes. "How did you manage to make so many cupcakes in less than a week, Claire?" asked Ashley as she took in the endless boxes at the back of the car. Leandra helped me make them. We would wake up at 12 every night and bake as many cupcakes as we could before we had to do our daily chores," answered Claire, very pleased that their efforts had paid off in such a big way. "We plan to use the money we make to pay the bills of the school, so that Cunningham wouldn't have to sell more benches," continued Claire. "Why not use the money to buy benches and replace the ones he sold? We could always use candles if the power gets cut," suggested Ashley as she took in the warm deed that Claire was doing for the school. "That does sound smart, but where on earth will we find school benches for sale?" asked Claire, pondering the idea. "Mr. Copperfield is selling some benches and chairs, he's moving to London next fall. Why don't you buy some of his benches with the money you raise?" suggested Ashley. Claire embraced the idea with a huge smile. It would be so easy, and she was sure that they would raise enough money to buy benches. They arrived at the market before most of the people did. Claire unfolded a table that she had found in the kitchen and threw a picnic cloth over it. They placed the cupcakes on top of it and had no difficulty selling every last one of them. Even though they used the same icing for all of the cupcakes, a chocolate icing that smelt strongly of mint, the cupcakes were a hit and they had made a lot of money that day. Once they gathered the laundry and placed the bundles in their truck, they drove back to the boarding home. Neither of them were aware of how long they had been away, and all that reminded Claire of the time was the loud grumbling of her stomach. "Did you hear about what happened this afternoon?" asked Miriam as she ran up to Claire once Claire had arrived. "No, I'm afraid not. We were out at town, me and Ashley," replied Claire as she turned to face Miriam. "A detective was here, Mr. Lockwood Thorne. He was sent by the city guard. He's here to investigate fraud or something. Cunningham really got us into trouble this time, Claire. He said he'll be back tomorrow," expounded Miriam very nervously. "What? Did he ask you any questions, Miriam?" asked Claire, very surprised by what she was hearing. No, he only talked to the gardener and Mrs. Cunningham. I have no idea how long he was here, but everyone stared at him as he left," continued Miriam in the same breathless frenzy. Claire knew she'd have to talk to Mr. Appleton about this, find out what the detective had said. Fear gripped Claire more than anything else. If this institution would be closed down, she'd have nowhere to go. She had no family in this country and hardly had any savings. What about poor Mr. Appleton? Where would he go? "Never mind that, Miriam, I'm sure it's nothing serious. Cunningham should know how to cover his tracks well by now," replied Claire after a while, once the shock of that announcement begun to settle. The following day, Claire and two other governesses were hanging clothes on the wire outside. From the side of her eye, she saw Mr. Appleton's garden. Winter had begun and soon it would be covered with snow. For now, though, it looked like a decent garden. There were endless rows of planted seeds. What seeds they were, he only knew. In the distance she saw Mr. Appleton, wearing a thicker jersey perhaps, but still on his knees tending to his garden with the greatest of care. Claire smiled at the thought of the color and life that such a big garden would give their school. "We have to meet at the chapel in 10 minutes, Claire. Mrs. Brighton is having her twins christened and the pastor came to carry out the ceremony," said Auditrine, one of the governesses. Except for Sunday's church, Claire never really visited the chapel. Besides that, she had never seen a christening happen before. Whether she herself was christened or not, only her parents knew. "All right then, let's get ready for that," said Claire and returned to the boarding home to freshen up for the ceremony. A great many people attended the christening of Mrs. Brighton's twins. Mrs. Brighton was a teacher at the institution and her husband worked at the train station. They had just moved into the boarding home when the twins were born. "I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. May all the church say Amen," said the pastor as he immersed part of the head of the first twin into a silver bowl of water. Everyone said Amen uniformly as this action was repeated with both the twins. Claire thought that their lives were very humble and simple, nothing of extravagance, yet something to be desired. She wondered what it would be like to have a job as good as that of a teacher. As attractive as that seemed, living at an institution like that was enough to ruin the lovely image she had imagined of a school teacher's life. If she would have children or be married, it would probably have to be away from a place like that to appeal to Claire. As the week went by, Mr. Lockwood Thorne kept coming to the boarding home and talking to various members of the staff. Claire had no idea what this would lead to. Cunningham would repeatedly instruct the staff not to engage into any conversation with the persistent Lockwood Thorne. This made Claire want to talk to him more, if only to know what his investigation was about. On the morning of Friday, Claire was sweeping one of the porches when she saw Mr. Appleton watering a few plants. Winter was approaching, but some of his plants had already begun to grow. She walked over to his garden and waved at him once she caught his eye. He stopped watering the plants and took off his hat when she reached the fence. "Good day, Mr. Appleton, your garden is coming to life," yelled Claire from behind the fence. "Good day, Miss Claire, would you care to join me?" he said in his humble manner as he walked over to the gate to let her into his garden. The ground was so well plowed and she could see tiny shrubs begin to appear. "This is looking lovely, Mr. Appleton, what hours you must have spent doing this," commented Claire as she took it all in. "Thank you, Miss Claire, I'm glad you like it," replied Mr. Appleton. Soon a small black police car drove into the school's driveway and they both watched as it parked right near to the garden. It was Mr. Lockwood Thorne again, dressed in his grey coat as usual. He got out of his car with a folder in his hand and walked to where they were. Lockwood Thorne was a very handsome man. Claire noticed how smart he looked in his grey coat and thought that he must have been fairly rich. "Good morning, Mr. Appleton." "Good morning, ma'am, Adam Lockwood Thorne," he greeted, taking off his hat as he introduced himself to Claire. Both Mr. Appleton and Claire were very suspicious of this visit since Cunningham had told everyone more than once not to answer any of his questions. He took a card out and offered it to Mr. Appleton, but he declined to take it. Claire reached over to take his card and put it in her pocket. "How may we help you, sir?" asked Mr. Appleton, folding his arms together as he looked at him. "I received word from my superior. Apparently Mr. Cunningham and his wife took a vacation a few days ago. I found out that the municipality had planned to close the water at the school about that same time. Where could I get a list of the school's expenses during that month?" asked Mr. Lockwood Thorne as he went through his folders. Mr. Appleton looked nervously at Claire, not sure what he should say. Claire cleared her throat and took the initiative to say something. "We've recently bought new dishes, plates, and pans for the school. Along with other improvements we have made to the establishment, money could easily have been spent up," Claire announced, remembering the few utensils they had bought a week ago. This was a poorly thought-up explanation, and the stern look on Mr. Lockwood Thorne's face let Claire know that he wasn't buying it. Mr. Appleton returned to tending the garden and Lockwood Thorne turned to face Claire. "Could you show me the improvements that you speak of, ma'am?" asked Mr. Lockwood Thorne as he reached out his arm towards Claire. She took hold of his arm, not sure what to show him first. They slowly walked out of the garden since Claire was buying time. She then led him down one of the many long corridors. "These walls have been repainted, summer peach was the color we all voted for," began Claire, pointing at walls that had been repainted at least 2 years ago. "Have you noticed any suspicious activities from the headmaster, ma'am?" asked Mr. Lockwood Thorne a bit more sternly, unimpressed by the faded paint of the school walls. Claire had no idea what to say at this point. She knew that she wasn't supposed to say anything about Cunningham. She knew she had to find a way to keep Lockwood Thorne away from their school, but by now she was very enamored with him and wanted him to keep coming by. She could barely get herself to make proper sentences before him, but he seemed to have no idea of what effect he was having on her. She pondered of what to do. She knew that if she told the truth of Mr. Cunningham's dealings she would be out on the streets, and the institution closed. She also realized that she was madly infatuated with Mr. Lockwood Thorne and wanted to help him, as much as she could, without giving him any help at all. "Are you okay, miss?" he asked, inquiring what her name was with his hand. Miss Clare. She responded, not noticing how much time she had spent pondering the situation. Yes, I'm fine. Do you like French cuisine, sir? Asked Claire once she got hold of herself again. What do you mean, Miss Clare? Asked Lockwood Thorne. I know a place that has just opened in town this fall, J.E. Maple. Why don't we discuss this matter over there, so I would draw less suspicion to myself? Suggested Claire, very unsure of what the look in his eyes meant. All right, Miss Clare, that sounds reasonable. Would you care to direct me? Said Mr. Lockwood Thorne. Claire followed him to his car and they drove out of the school to the town. It seemed much emptier in town than when Claire had gone to sell her cupcakes there. Perhaps people were preparing themselves for the cold winter that would soon be upon them and stayed home. There it is! Exclaimed Claire as she saw the golden sign that read the restaurant's name. Lockwood Thorne parked his car near the entrance. They got out and walked to the restaurant in a very uncomfortable silence. Claire pondered about what was going through his mind every step of the way. Could I please have a table for two? Asked Mr. Lockwood Thorne at the reception. They followed a pint-sized waitress to a table near the window and took their seats. He opened his folder that he still had with him and went through it a bit. After a few minutes he turned his gaze towards Claire and decided he would question her about the electrical bill once more. He could tell from the look in her eyes that she wasn't about to give him any meaningful answers, but it was worth the try. How could the school have covered a $5,000 bill a week after it declared bankruptcy? Asked Mr. Lockwood Thorne, hoping he had put it in a way she would understand. I remember the school fees being raised at the beginning of this year. Replied Claire. He looked at her, not saying a word. She hoped this would be the last question she'd have to answer for that night, but knew that it wouldn't be. He penned down what she said into his notebook and looked back at her, as if he was prepared to ask another question. She was as dazed as a lovesick child each time he looked her way. Maybe she could compose herself if she turned away from his gaze. She distracted herself by calling the waitress to their table. It was a helpful distraction from the handsome Lockwood Thorne, who had the power to get any information out of her in that moment. They ordered their meals and spent the rest of the dinner discussing meaningless topics like the school ball or graduation ceremony that autumn. Claire would say anything to keep the truth of Cunningham's dealings a secret while maintaining the attentions of Lockwood Thorne. The next morning she ran to Mr. Appleton's gardens in search of him. He was there as usual tending to the plants. He greeted her in the polite manner that he always did. Claire opened the gate and ran to where Mr. Appleton was, full of excitement about what had happened the day before. You won't believe it, Mr. Appleton, I went to dinner with Mr. Lockwood Thorne yesterday. He even footed the bill. Began Claire, a broad smile embracing her face after she had said that. Mr. Appleton laughed at this and thought she was acting like a silly schoolgirl perhaps. That's nice to hear, ma'am, I hope you enjoyed that meal. Said Mr. Appleton, laughing at the sight of Claire in her purple dress. They both laughed, Mr. Appleton probably more so. What will happen to your lovely garden during the coming winter, Mr. Appleton? I think the snow will be thick this year. Said Claire after a while, looking at all of his hard work. Not to worry, Miss Clare, I've planted some peas and corn in the old barn. Would you like to see our indoor gardens, Miss Clare? Asked Mr. Appleton as he stretched forth his arm for her to take. She nodded her head playfully and took hold of his arm as he led her to the barn. His arms were really thick for a common gardener. Perhaps he had done manual labor in a factory before he became a gardener, she thought. Once they got to the barn, Claire could barely believe what she was seeing. The old barn that no one visited had been turned into a beautiful display of empty garden beds, probably containing every seed imaginable. All the plows and rakes were packed very neatly on a wooden tray, suspended against one of the barn walls. The paths near the rows of gardens were very tidy, and for a while Claire wondered if Mr. Appleton had brought anyone else to his lovely indoor garden. Has anyone else been in here? Asked Claire as she spun around in amazement. Yes, ma'am, the boys from 5th grade would help me plant some of these seeds during lunch hour. Mr. Lockwood Thorne got his hands dirty as well. This was done with the effort of many people, answered Mr. Appleton as he took in the wonder of all his work. Claire's heart skipped a beat when she heard him talk of Lockwood Thorne. The mere mention of his name was pure joy to her. Was Lockwood Thorne in here? She asked, and she turned towards Mr. Appleton. He smiled and nodded his head. Soon after that the bell rang and Claire remembered that she was on kitchen duty for that week. "By Mr. Appleton, I must be off," she yelled as she ran towards the large kitchen that had begun to fill up with famished students. She ran to the dining hall and put her apron on as the students began to line up for lunch. "Where have you been?" asked Ashley as she was putting her apron on. "I've been around," replied Claire, trying hard to straighten her dress after all the running she had done that day. "I heard that Mr. Cunningham had received special visitors this afternoon. They're still at his place apparently," said Ashley as she handed bananas to the students that were dishing up their lunches. "What?" asked Claire, trying to make sense of what Ashley was saying among all the clamor of the students. "Well, I'm getting to the bottom of it. I'm delivering fresh vegetables to their house after supper, with Kate. Are you going to join us or what?" continued Ashley amidst the noise of the children in the hall. The thought was very tempting to Claire. She could, perhaps, see or hear for herself who these visitors were. Yes, I'll join you," said Claire, very determined to get as much information out of this as she possibly could. One of the students, Mary Beth Weaver, was listening in on this conversation, but neither of them had noticed her. As soon as the children had received their food, Ashley, Kate, and Claire were off to Cunningham's house. Claire had never been to their house before and she could feel her hands shake as she held on to the vase full of corn that she was carrying. "I think that Cunningham did it this time. What could they be talking about?" whispered Ashley as they got into his house and looked at the three men talking to him. Every inch of them looked like criminals. They wore dirty, torn jeans and smoked awful cigars that polluted the air around them. Whatever conversation they were having must have been serious because not one of them looked at any of the girls, as Mrs. Cunningham directed them to the kitchen. Claire wanted more than anything to hear what they were talking about. She stood very close to the door and listened as hard as she could. "We drop 'em off here tomorrow in boxes. You seal the boxes with duct tape or something and say it's paint. Send it off to Amsterdam and $50,000 is in your bank by Friday, easy," said one of the burly men as he explained the plan to Cunningham. She knew the significance of what she had just heard and knew that the knowledge of this transaction had put enormous power into her hands. She wanted to keep listening but was disturbed from her purpose when Kate pulled the vase out of her hand. "Wake up, silly, we have items to deliver," joked Kate, and smiled at the puzzled Claire. They went back to the dorm once they were done delivering the vegetables. Claire didn't tell Ashley what she had heard. In that moment she had no idea who to tell. She hardly slept that night. Claire knew she had to tell Mr. Appleton about this as soon as she could. He might know what to do about it, more so than Ashley. The next morning she woke up with the determination to expose this transaction before it went down. Exposing this, however, would mean that the institution would most likely be closed and she would be on the streets. She had to do whatever she was going to do very wisely. As soon as breakfast was served and the children off to their classes, Claire sneaked away to Mr. Appleton's gardens. By now the chill of the air had begun to engulf the world all around them, and winter was very certainly approaching them. She got to the gardens and saw Mr. Appleton in the distance. He had begun disposing of the dead plants. Claire opened the gate and walked up to him, pondering what she would say every step of the way. This wasn't going to be easy. "Good morning, Mr. Appleton, nice day today, isn't it?" she said once she reached him. "Good morning, Miss Claire, I'd say it's a cold day and not as nice as it could be," he replied, removing his hat to greet the lady. "I have something very grave to tell you, Mr. Appleton. It's a horrible thing and I wish I had never heard what I did." began Claire. Mr. Appleton grew alarmed at the sound of her voice and completely stopped what he had been doing to hear this. Has anyone dropped off any boxes of paint at the school lately, Mr. Appleton? She asked. Yes, ma'am, just this morning. We placed them in the gym because of how many they were. I helped unloading them, replied Mr. Appleton, having no idea of what he had been a part of that morning. That is not paint, Mr. Appleton. I am not sure what illegal substances they contain, but they don't contain any paint, blurted Claire as she tried to explain this to him. What do you mean, ma'am? He asked as he pondered the pale look on her face. I heard criminal men talk about this the other day. They dropped the boxes at the school and Mr. Cunningham had to say it was paint. Now he has to send these boxes off to Amsterdam and $50,000 will be in his bank account. We have to find out what is in those boxes, sir. If our school has become a smuggling port, then situations could get dangerous for the children, she said, barely catching her breath as she rushed through her words. Mr. Appleton was very alarmed by what he had just heard and had no idea what to make of it. What could this lead to, and how long has Cunningham been smuggling through the school? There's only one way to know for sure what is in those boxes, said Mr. Appleton. Yes, I thought of that as well. It would be hard to take one of the boxes since they are all numbered perhaps. So I thought of something smarter, said Claire. Appleton walked over to Claire. Well, ma'am, what's your plan? He asked, once he reached her. The school is completely quiet at night. Leandra and I would bake cupcakes late at night. No one ever heard us or knew what it was that we were doing. We could do the same, wake up late at night and find out what is in those boxes, said Claire. Why were you baking cupcakes late at night, Miss Claire? Asked Mr. Appleton, pondering about what she had just said. To raise money for the school. With the money we raised, we were able to pay some of the school bills and expenses, replied Claire, quite pleased with herself for coming up with such a brilliant idea. What time do you suggest we do this, Miss Claire? Mr. Appleton asked. I'll wake up at 1 a.m., then I'll come knock at your door to wake you, replied Claire as she thought of how she would pull this off. When 1 a.m. came by, Claire got woken up by the alarm she had put on. Oh, put it off, will you? Yelled Ashley, rolling over in her bed. Claire switched off her alarm and ran to Ashley's bed. There's something I'm going to do with Mr. Appleton tonight, very important. Will you come? Asked Claire while Ashley sat up in her bed. She rubbed her eyes as she took in what Claire was saying. Whatever, let's go, complied Ashley and got out of her bed. They walked to the gardener's house as soon as they got dressed. It was a small cottage at the back of the school with a big chimney that was always blowing smoke. They knocked on his door with no reply. Then Ashley went to knock on his window and Mr. Appleton woke up. He invited them in and the warmth of the house was very welcoming. He had obviously put out the fire, but smoke still lingered from the fireplace. I will get dressed now, it will only take a minute, said Mr. Appleton as he returned to his bedroom. Claire nodded her head and walked over to where Ashley was. I have always wanted to visit France, said Ashley as she pointed to a picture of the young Mr. Appleton standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. Maybe he would tend gardens in France, remarked Claire, and they both started laughing. Do they have gardens in France? Joked Ashley, and they kept laughing. Yes, ma'am, they do, many beautiful gardens. I owned a garden in France once, said Mr. Appleton as he walked into the room. As a matter of fact, it was quite a large garden. Julien planted every seed imaginable, he continued as he buttoned his coat. Who's Julien, and why did you leave France to come here? Asked Claire, intrigued by this. Julien was my wife, we had a little boy named Jean-Lucas. Here they are, answered Appleton, and pointed them to a picture of a lovely brunette lady holding a toddler. She was so fair, Claire stared at the lovely Julien in the picture. She had wind blowing through her hair and her teeth were as white as chalk. She smiled joyfully with the little boy in her arms. The room grew quiet as Claire began to understand that Julienne was probably not around anymore. Claire didn't think anyone would leave their families so far away, the thought was a heavy one. "Are they still in France?" asked Ashley. "Yes ma'am, they are both buried in France," answered Mr. Appleton, confirming what Claire was thinking. The silence grew thick. Neither of the girls knew what was said in a moment like that one. "How did they die?" asked Ashley, fearlessly breaking the silence. "They were going to Paris, to visit my mother-in-law. I was told that the train swerved off of the tracks, over a bridge. 500 people died that day. When they found their bodies they allowed me to give my family a proper burial," he answered, looking hard at the picture of a happy Julienne with Jean Lucas in her arms. "So you became a gardener?" continued Ashley, seemingly oblivious to his pain. "Hush Ashley!" interjected Claire, trying to prevent a reply to her heartless question. "I hope we can get to the gym without being detected by anyone," said Claire in an attempt to change the topic. "I have 2 flashlights here, the 2 of you could use one and I'll use the other," suggested Mr. Appleton. They got to the school hall and entered quite easily through the kitchen. Claire had asked for the keys to that kitchen door from Miriam earlier and they got to the gym that way. Once they reached the gym, they moved very slowly and carefully to where the boxes were. "We can open one of the boxes and take pictures of its contents. Look for a box that is broken or stained so that people wouldn't notice that it had been tampered with," whispered Mr. Appleton. "Found one," said Ashley, pointing to a box that had fallen from one of the crates and was torn halfway through the middle. The boxes had obviously not been sealed with duct tape yet, so they had come early enough. Mr. Appleton very carefully opened that box and it was filled with layer upon layer of bags containing a white powdery substance. Mr. Appleton picked up one and told them that it was cocaine. There were some needles at the bottom of the box as well. They took pictures of all that they saw with a very old camera that Claire had won in 5th grade, and closed the box up again. For them it was clear that the school had become a smuggling ground and this was probably not the first cargo that had been delivered there. Days went by and none of them had said anything about this issue. Claire had told Ashley and Mr. Appleton not to tell a soul because authorities would close the school for good if news of such dealings came to them. Naturally, Lockwood Thorne got tip-offs about Mr. Cunningham and Claire kept wondering if she should tell him. Every time the dashing Mr. Lockwood Thorne came by, Claire would spend hours discussing meaningless topics, and he eventually noticed that she was wasting his time, to distract him from whatever she was hiding. "Miss Claire, pardon my rude objection, but you told me about the school ball 10 times by now. I heard about paint boxes being sent to Amsterdam and I have no idea how the school obtained so many boxes of paint in the first place," said Lockwood Thorne as he paced around. Claire knew he was getting too close to the truth, so she decided to switch the topic. "Have you been to Mr. Appleton's indoor gardens lately? Why, with such thick snow his indoor gardens are the most popular place on the campus right now. Come, let's go," enthused Claire and beckoned for Mr. Lockwood Thorne to follow her. They got to the big garden in the barn with plants and trees of all kinds. They obviously lacked sunlight, but they were so well tended to, that flowers were growing and small green grapes had begun to hang from the vines. It was certainly a brilliant idea to plant an indoor garden, and the school had enough food for the students in winter for the first time. "Do you go to the park often?" "The park in town?" asked Claire. "Why would I waste my time walking around a park when I have so much work to do, Miss Claire?" answered Lockwood Thorne, looking around at the wonderful indoor garden. "It would clear your mind, maybe help you get the closure you seek. Come, let's go there," suggested Claire, hoping to sell the idea with a broad smile on her face. Lockwood Thorne pondered this for a while and soon agreed to the idea. "It might be a lovely diversion from all of this," he said, and they walked to his car. "It will be. I love the way the snow decorates the many trees in the garden. Like shaking a snow globe really hard," enthused Claire. The romance of the park in winter seemed like the perfect place for Mr. Lockwood Thorne to confess his love for her. In her mind she had planned the perfect home they would have, how she would blush each time that someone called her Mrs. Lockwood Thorne. She had even planned how many children they would have. They walked through the park once they reached it, admiring the beautiful scenery. After that, they found us at the market and we had detention for a week. I had a blast in college, it was an amazing experience. Narrated Detective Lockwood Thorne as he told Claire about his years in college. Sounds like it. I never went to college, only finished grade school. My parents could not afford high school, so I worked as a waitress before I got this job," said Claire, a bit disappointed at how boring her story sounded compared to his. "So what was it like for you, before you came to England?" asked Mr. Lockwood Thorne. "Simple, I guess. I couldn't long for much because many of the people in my village in Ireland were just as poor as I was. Coming here was like entering the higher ranks of society, even if I'm only a governess," said Claire as she remembered the poor Irish village she grew up in. Suddenly she saw a familiar person, Mary Beth Weaver, a girl in their dorm. She was surprised by this sight and expected her to be at lunch with the other students. "Mary Beth Weaver. Is that you, child?" called Claire, and the young girl caught her gaze. She ran over to the girl wondering how she got out of the campus without being noticed by a superior. "What on earth brings you here, child? Why aren't you at lunch with the other children?" asked Claire once she reached the little girl. "I heard you talking to Miss Ashley in the cafeteria the other day, about Mr. Cunningham's dodgy dealings," responded a very confident Mary Beth, once Claire had reached her. "What in the world? You have no business getting involved in any of this, child. How old are you?" asked Claire, very surprised by what she was hearing. "Old enough to know that Mr. Cunningham is dealing drugs, amongst other things. When my parents enrolled me at the Cunningham boarding school, I was determined to leave," began Mary Beth, not a bit nervous that she was caught by her governess outside of the school grounds. "In my many attempts to return home I found out about Mr. Cunningham's interesting friends. I overheard many things because I would hide behind a door when he was on his phone. The many things I have heard would make your ears tingle, Miss Claire," continued Mary Beth. Claire was surprised by this new development. She turned around to look at Mr. Lockwood Thorne pacing around. She didn't want any of this to come to his ears, so she had to find a way to make Mary Beth conceal it from him as well. "You must not tell anyone about this, Mary Beth, or else the authorities will close the institution down," whispered Claire as she kneeled down before Mary Beth. "But I came to town so that I could take the bus to the police station and blow this whole thing open. Cunningham sent a cargo of baby diapers to London this morning. We all know that there is not one diaper in any of those boxes," replied Mary Beth. "If we expose him they will close down the school, it's all in his name," said Claire in a more desperate tone, uncertain of her future outside of the institution. "I want to go home, Miss Claire, that's why I'm exposing this. He uses the school to transport drugs illegally. Do you know how much danger all of us are in?" asked Mary Beth as she grew more determined to expose Cunningham. "Fine, but you'll need proof. Have you any?" continued Claire, giving in to the realization that this wasn't a secret anymore. "What do you mean?" "I'll just tell them what I saw and that they should inspect the so-called diapers that he sent to London," replied Mary Beth. "Physical proof is needed, child, otherwise we would not be able to take this to the authorities. If all we have are words, then our case could be dismissed and Cunningham would have us both out on the streets by the end of the week," explained Claire, looking over at Mr. Lockwood Thorne as he paced back and forth. "Who's that?" asked Mary Beth when she saw Claire looking at Lockwood Thorne. "He's the detective that keeps coming around. He's trying to uncover Cunningham, but I doubt he can," said Claire as she glanced at him. "That's it. He is the person we need to expose this, Miss Claire," exclaimed Mary Beth with excitement. "I thought of that, then I realized, if they should close down the school I would. Claire stopped herself before she continued. This was a child, how could she understand Claire's delicate disposition? Mary Beth knew that there was a reason that Claire didn't expose this but didn't know or care about that reason. So you didn't tell him, did you? Added Mary Beth. You should tell him, I can't, said Claire once she had caught the gaze of Lockwood Thorne. Mary Beth couldn't understand why Claire was so nervous. She soon ran towards Mr. Lockwood Thorne to expose all of this. Good afternoon, sir, said Mary Beth as she curtsied before Detective Lockwood Thorne. How do you do, ma'am? Replied Mr. Lockwood Thorne, bowing before the tiny lady. I have something very important to tell you, we have something very important to tell you, said Mary Beth as Claire joined them. Really? What could that be, ma'am? Said Lockwood Thorne as he kneeled down to converse with Mary Beth. Mary Beth looked at Claire, not sure how she was supposed to say it. Claire nodded her head and Mary Beth decided to continue. Miss Claire told me that you were investigating the affairs of our school, to know if any illegal activity was occurring there. She began, having gained his complete attention in that sentence. Yes, I am. How old are you, little girl? Asked Lockwood Thorne, very surprised that she knew anything about this. I'll be 9 in a few weeks. That's not important, what's important is the very interesting news I have to share with you about Mr. Cunningham, replied Mary Beth. The atmosphere grew a lot tenser when Mary Beth mentioned Cunningham. He asked her to continue. Mr. Cunningham has been transporting illegal goods through the school. He sells them as diapers, paint, or anything that is transported in bulk. The boxes are always covered with many layers of tape and they are usually delivered on Fridays. Continued Mary Beth, speeding through her sentence. I knew it, said Lockwood Thorne as he stood up. He paced around, running his hand through his beard. You knew? Asked Mary Beth, looking at Claire. Not everything that you just told me, but I knew that he was using the school to cover up his illegal dealings. He answered, looking at her and then at Claire. Did you know about this, Miss Claire? He asked as he came to terms with the probability that she could have been hiding it from him. They stood in silence and Claire looked away. How long have you known about this? Continued Lockwood Thorne, turning to her. She kept quiet, she had no idea what to say at that point. If only he knew that she had nowhere else to go. We could go to the police station and blow this whole thing open right now, yelled Mary Beth, excited that she would get to go home at last. No, we have no proof. That could also put us all in great danger, said Claire, the panic in her voice as clear as day. She's right, Mary Beth, we need solid proof. Pictures perhaps, writings, recorded phone calls. Before then it's our word against his, said Detective Lockwood Thorne as this case finally got direction in his mind. That's no problem, I know every place they meet on the campus. Usually at his house, sometimes at the library, and once they met in the 3rd grade class when school was out, said Mary Beth, much more excited about this than anyone else was. That winter went by without any other cargo delivered to the school. Claire and Mary Beth waited to see any trace of it, but not so much as a parcel was delivered to their school. Cunningham seemed to get smarter in his dealings and began to lay low. He agreed to be interviewed by Mr. Lockwood Thorne but was very tight-lipped about everything. He seemed to have a perfect alibi for everything he did and they weren't getting anywhere with the case. Spring came to the Cunningham boarding school and Mr. Appleton's gardens filled the campus with life. The year 1922 had begun and the students that had gone home for the holidays were returning. Few of the students had never left since they lived very far away. Claire loved the way the gardens sprung to life as soon as winter was over. She decided to pay Mr. Appleton a visit one afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Appleton, yelled Claire from the gate of his garden. Good afternoon, Miss Claire. Feel free to let yourself in, he replied with the broadest of smiles on his face. She entered the garden and gladly ran to where he was. Your garden looks lovely, Mr. Appleton, said Claire as she looked around her at the beauty. I love spring. Best time of the year for my gardens. He said. That's very true, it all looks divine, replied Claire while her eyes went over all the flowers in their range. She saw the trees that had been dead for years, bearing fruit again, and the watermelons, that looked larger than they had ever looked before. The school will not be going hungry this year at all, added Claire. He laughed at that and continued watering flowers with a very ancient water pot. Claire thought she would ask about whether Mr. Lockwoodthorne had been around the school lately. Mr. Appleton, I was wondering, has Mr. Lockwoodthorne been around here lately? She asked, kicking a few leaves with her feet. He was here just yesterday. Miss Claire asked me about whether people have been delivering any boxes to the school lately. He even asked me about you, Miss Claire, replied Mr. Appleton. About me? Really? Asked Claire, dearly hoping she had been on his mind as much as he had been on hers. Yes ma'am, he did, responded Mr. Appleton with a grin. I told him about Mr. Cunningham and the boxes that arrive at the school. Well, a little girl named Mary Beth told him, to be exact, said Claire, curling the rope that tied her dress around her finger as she did. He knows everything. All we need now is solid evidence, she continued. Mr. Appleton continued with what he was doing. He didn't seem puzzled by Claire's revelation. Claire turned her focus to the beautiful garden that was coming to life after the harsh winter. The sight seemed to restore all the hope that had faded in her heart. Her future would be an uncertain one if the institution was closed because of Mr. Cunningham. She was hoping that, as long as the flowers bloomed every spring, she would have a place to sleep. You know, Miss Claire, I brought these roses with me from France. They were Julienne's favorite roses and I plant some of them wherever I go, he said as he looked at a row of beautiful purple roses. She admired the beauty of the roses. She also admired the fact that he took Julienne with him wherever he went. Maybe that would seem like a heavy burden to carry for the rest of your life, but for Mr. Appleton it was a cause of great joy to take his Julienne with him wherever he went, like she was never gone. Alright class, today we'll be reading from Psalm chapter 23, a psalm of King David. Do you all have your Bibles with you? Said their teacher Miss Summers as addressed her students. The students got their Bibles out their bags and after a while they all began to read out loud. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, he leadeth me beside the still water. Read the students from their Bibles. Just then Mary Beth looked around to see Mr. Cunningham talking to one of the teachers. She couldn't tell what it was that they were talking about, but she was sure that she would find out later that day. Just then Mr. Cunningham caught her eye and they stared at each other for a deathly minute. Yet, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me, read the students, Miss Summers wondering what it was that Mary Beth was looking so intently at. Claire went off to the dining hall when she heard Ashley calling her. They had to prepare the evening meal that day. Saw that detective guy in town today, said he'd be coming over tomorrow, said Kate as she stirred the stew. She noticed how Claire stood still when she said that and smiled a bit. You like him, don't you? Continued Kate. Claire giggled at this and turned around to reply. He's okay, but not my type. He's too tall, replied Claire, not trying much to convince Kate of her apparent indifference towards him. She was hopelessly infatuated with him and had only imagined their wedding 1,000 times. She would be a detective's wife and a mother. She would have the security she had only ever dreamt of. She was sure that nobody knew of this and would keep her thoughts of him to herself. Just then Mr. Cunningham's wife walked into the kitchen, a rather tall and sickly-looking lady. She had grown much thinner since the last time Claire had seen her, and the only signs of beauty in her face were perhaps her flawless features. She addressed the governesses with her whistle-sharp voice. The fish we get from Mr. Braun's harbor will be delivered late this year. That means that you have to make the food we have last longer. Reduce the portion sizes at once, she concluded in her stern tone. No one dared to say a word, and Claire could feel the distress that would erupt from that announcement. Mrs. Cunningham turned on her heel and walked out, leaving the air behind her as thick as a wet cloth. The portions had been cut twice that year, and this could cause the students to complain or leave the institution altogether. I saw the fish truck at the back of the school this morning. If they don't have fish in there, I wonder what they do have, said Ashley as soon as Mrs. Cunningham was gone. The room was quiet after she had said that. Since meat portions are being reduced, we might as well increase the vegetable portions. Appleton's gardens are growing larger by the day, said Catherine, one of the governesses. Claire suspected that something else was in that fish truck. She thought she had to find out what was in those trucks when everyone was asleep. Dinner went well that evening, and Claire waited under her blankets till the lights were all out in the dorm. She folded her blanket neatly and hoped that no one would hear her as she walked out of the room. She jogged down the corridor, and as soon as she got to the stairs she could hear Ashley's voice calling after her. "Wait up!" called Ashley in a loud whisper. "I knew there was a reason for you going to bed with a jacket and sneakers on." "You're not very subtle, are you, Claire?" said Ashley once she caught up to Claire. "Hush, Ashley, no one should hear us," whispered Claire as she looked around her. "Where are we off to?" whispered Ashley as she buttoned her coat. Claire wanted to tell her to return to their room but didn't think it would be wise to make any more noise. "All right, follow me," she whispered and turned around to leave. They walked down the stairs and through a long corridor that led to the back of the dining hall. "I asked Lady Martins to leave this door open for me after the kids had left the dining hall. You must not tell a soul about this, Ashley," said Claire while they walked through the wooden door. "I thought that old bat doesn't talk to anyone." "How on earth did you do it?" joked Ashley. "She's not an old bat, you know, she's a rather nice Polish lady. The only reason she doesn't talk to anyone is because she hardly understands a word in English. I teach her basic words in English at times, that's how I got her to leave the door open for me," replied Claire. She saw the truck and told Ashley what her plan was. "So you want to know what is in that truck so you can do what again?" asked Ashley as they made their way through Mr. Appleton's rose bushes. "So I could tell Detective Lockwood Thorne." "You know him, right?" replied Claire. "Yeah, that hunky detective that we were sworn not to talk to," said Ashley as she followed Claire to the truck. They reached the fishing truck and noticed it was heavily locked. It didn't make sense that a delivery truck would have so many heavy locks on it. Claire decided to knock on the truck in order to have an idea of what she was knocking against. She thought that was silly but did it anyway. "Claire, I hear something," said Ashley in as soft a tone as she could. Claire ran to where Ashley was and put her ear to the truck. They heard very soft sobs of what sounded like a little girl. A human being? How many of them were there? Claire heard more people cry and a few conversing in an unknown language. How long had they been there? "Can you hear us?" whispered Ashley as she knocked harder on the wall of the truck. The people inside there seemed to understand that someone had noticed them, and they all began to cry for help in whatever language it was that they spoke. Claire saw a light going on in the house near the truck. "Come, Ashley, come," she said as she pulled her to cover before anyone noticed that they were there. This had all become very dangerous very fast. Claire had only ever heard of the traffic of women into brothels, but now she had probably witnessed the traffic of men, women, and children for who knows what. How on earth could anyone be cruel enough to lock other humans in a truck? How much ventilation did they have in there? "Who's there?" yelled the man who had come out of the house with a torchlight. Ashley and Claire hid behind a wall and neither of them made a sound. He looked at the truck and made sure that all the locks were sealed. Then he went back into his house and switched the lights off. Claire and Ashley ran back to the dorm as fast as they could. "I'm not going anywhere with you again." "What in the world?" yelled Ashley as tears ran down her face. They were both in a state of shock. The situation had taken a very dark turn that night. "Do you have any coins on you?" asked Claire. She had to run to the payphone and call Lockwood Thorne before anything tragic happened to those people. Ashley gave her a few coins from her pocket and ran off to their room. Claire had never seen so much fright in anyone's face. She wondered what her face looked like. She didn't have much time to ponder these things and quickly left for the payphone near the headmaster's office on the school grounds. She desperately hoped that no one would see her as she ran through the darkness with frightening determination. Once she reached the payphone, she saw two men standing there, so she hid herself near the staircase. "Once we get word from Cunningham, we drive to the border," said one of the men. He had a cigar in his hand. "No, it's too dangerous to leave the truck here. Take it with you, check them to know which ones are still alive. Jay said that they are worth more alive than dead," said the other man. "Cool, see you at the border, Antonio," replied the guy with the cigar and left. Claire watched to see what Antonio would do, but he left soon after checking his watch. She had begun to piece things together in her mind. Dude with cigar was taking the truck of people back to his house to check if they were still alive. Somehow these people were a cargo that would be smuggled through the border. Antonio was probably a ringleader of sorts, but Cunningham was running the entire thing. Maybe they had begun smuggling humans as well, maybe they had done this for a while. As soon as they were gone, Claire made sure there wasn't anyone else around and ran to the payphone. She pulled the card that Mr. Lockwood Thorne had given her out of her pocket and dialed his number. The phone rang for a while before he picked it up. "Hello," said Mr. Lockwood Thorne from the other side of the phone. "Detective Lockwood Thorne? It's me, it's Claire, the governess," she said as she kept looking around her in nervous panic. "Miss Claire? Do you know what time it is?" he asked as he yawned. "Never mind that, sir. I have something very grave to tell you. You must come to the institution at once. Bring your firearm with you," replied Claire. The shock of this announcement startled Lockwood Thorne. He feared for the worse because he was still very much aware of what Mary Beth had told him. "All right, I'll be there soon. Wait for me at the entrance gate," replied Detective Lockwood Thorne and hung up the phone to get dressed. Claire ran to the gate to wait for Lockwood Thorne. It was dark and very quiet. She tried her hardest not to make a noise. While she waited for him near the gate, she heard a truck approaching her. She turned around and saw the fishing truck driving towards the gate, so she hid herself before they could recognize her. The gate was locked, so a person with keys to the boarding home would have to unlock it. Once the truck stopped before the gate, Claire saw someone running towards the gate to unlock it. It was Mr. Cunningham. He had all the keys to all the gates and he opened that one for the truck to drive through. He locked the gate once the truck was gone and looked around to see if there was anyone there. He seemed to have the inclination that someone was there and looked around some more, very near to the place where Claire had hid herself. It was too dark for him to make out anything and he returned to his home after a few minutes. Claire had seen and heard enough to put her into a real state of panic that night. She ran to the hole in the gate that students had cut a few years ago to sneak out through. The headmaster never knew about it for some reason. Claire squeezed through it and ran to the road leading towards the school. She ran as far away from the school as she could but stayed on the road. She stopped after a few minutes of running. She would wait for Mr. Lockwood Thorne there, she thought. She hadn't waited for long when she saw his car approaching. She started jumping up and down, waving her hands in the air so that he could see her. He saw her and pulled off of the road right in front of her. She ran to his car and got into it. "It all got very dangerous, very fast," she said, still panting from her run. "Tell me," replied Detective Lockwood Thorne as he got his notebook and a pen from the dashboard. "People, in a windowless truck. I think Cunningham has switched to the traffic of human beings. We wondered why he was laying low for so long. It seems he had something much crueler in mind," reported Claire. "People? Did you see this? How much of it did you see?" said Lockwood Thorne as he kept paging through his notebook, looking for a clean page. "I didn't see them, but I heard them, me and Ashley." Well, Mrs. Cunningham told us to reduce meat portions since the fish wouldn't arrive till later in the year. One of the girls saw the fishing truck arrive though. Since it didn't contain fish apparently, I wanted to know what it did contain. Began Claire, barely pausing for breath as she narrated this. Detective Lockwood Thorne wrote down what she was saying after having found a clean page in his notebook. We went to see the truck. It was parked in one of the teachers' yards. We tapped on the truck to ascertain as to whether it was empty or full. When we did, we heard people, many people. Continued Claire as Lockwood Thorne speedily wrote down everything she was saying. He added to what Claire had told him, names of people and more. She breathed heavily. It was like one big moment had passed by since she heard the sobbing child in the truck till she got there. She had no idea how much time had passed by. "Whose names are you writing?" asked Claire as Lockwood Thorne was writing down a few names. "People that could be involved. This guy Alan Dawson works at the Border Patrol. We had a case with him transporting unknown parcels through the border a few years ago. We didn't have enough proof though. This woman, Edith Stewards, was involved with trafficking of children a few years ago. She cleared her tracks very well because we couldn't arrest her. All we had was the word of a witness who ended up dead a few weeks after he gave his witness report. I saw Edith talking to Mr. Cunningham the other day," answered Detective Lockwood Thorne. He seemed to be working on this case day and night because of the amount of knowledge he had about it. If only they could get evidence. If only she could place a recorder of sorts into Cunningham's house. "How are you feeling?" asked Lockwood Thorne as he placed his hand on hers. He looked directly into her eyes as he asked that. It was deep concern that he felt. Any person would have seen the concern. Claire, however, saw love. She wanted it to be love because she had grown to love him very much. Since the day she met him, she loved him. She had convinced herself that this concern he felt for her was a confirmation of the fact that he loved her as well. She wanted to believe so much, that in that moment he felt for her what she felt for him. Claire reached over from her seat and kissed him. He didn't return her kisses or exhibit any passion towards her in any way. In fact, he sat very still, obviously in a state of shock about Claire's violent affections for him. She sat back in her seat, almost inquiring what this distant silence meant. Was it her position in society that meant that he could never return her affections? She dearly hoped that wasn't the case. He sat there in shock for a brief while. She looked at him and he seemed to be very deep in thought. "Would you like me to drop you off at the boarding home?" he asked as he reached for the steering wheel. Claire didn't understand this. She had never before felt that way about a man and had convinced herself that she admired him for more than his exquisite good looks. She wasn't sure how these things were done though. "It's all right, sir, I could run back. It's not far from here," she said and turned to glare out of her window at the dark night. He ignited his car and she figured that she better get going. She said goodbye and he nodded his head. The situation, perhaps, was very odd for him. She felt too shy to ponder the situation any further and ran away from his car as fast as she could. He drove off with speed. Claire could only hear the noise that the tires made as he did. She was very embarrassed that she had done that. It was not like her at all. She got through the hole in the gate and managed to run to her dorm without making much noise. It would be a long night of Ashley's heartbreaking sobs in their room. Claire remembered the truck and the shock of it all came back to her gradually. "Why is Ashley crying?" asked Miriam. Claire had not an idea of what to say. Who would be prepared to hear of such a thing? 2 days had passed since that dreadful day and Claire had not seen the fishing truck again. She had not heard a word from Mr. Lockwood Thorne since the awkward kiss that they had shared. She had thought of him an awful lot and was hoping that he had thought of her as well. "You can borrow my purple cardigan, Claire, it would look so nice with that dress," said Catherine while they got ready for church. Claire tried on the cardigan and it looked lovely. It was an improvement from the brown leather coat that she was about to wear. They walked to the chapel at the back of the school. Apparently a missionary from Ireland was giving a message that day. The excitement of this visitor was probably why the chapel was packed full that Sunday. Even Mr. Appleton had showed up in a very smart coat that he must have ironed for hours. Claire waved at Mr. Appleton once she caught his eye. Everyone stood up from their chairs to sing from their hymn books after that. Morning Has Broken was the song they were directed to, and they all sang it as two of the music students played a piano and violin in near perfect union. After that, Pastor Gregory greeted the congregation and told them to turn their Bibles to James chapter 1 verse 27. He read the day's passage to the church, after which he called the missionary to the podium and introduced him to the congregation. "I'd like you to meet Pastor Philip James Avery, a Christian missionary from Ireland," introduced Pastor Gregory. Everyone applauded Pastor Avery as he walked towards the podium. Claire was very excited to hear his sermon. People in Ireland must have their own version of the gospel to preach, and she thought that it would be interesting to hear that. "Good morning, church. I'm a Jewish man from Ireland. I am here on a Christian mission, and to my great joy Pastor Gregory asked me to deliver a sermon this Sunday," he began. Claire looked at him with great anticipation. She hoped that he would deliver the sermon that converts Ashley to Christianity as she looked at her in the front quay. Keep your Bibles at the book of James. We will be reading from chapter 2 today. My sermon is titled, Works That Define Faith. We read in James chapter 2 verse 14. What doth it profit, my brethren, though a man say that he hath faith and have not works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister be naked, and destitute of daily food, and one of you say unto them, Depart in peace, be ye warmed and filled, notwithstanding ye give them not those things which are needful to the body, what doth it profit? Even so faith, if it hath not works, is dead, being alone. He read and looked up from his Bible to the congregation. These words illustrate clearly that faith without works is dead. Therefore we establish that works of charity and obedience are required to confirm our faith. I will list a few examples of works which are confirming of our faith in Jesus Christ. Praying for sick people and those in need as well as praying for ourselves is a work of faith. Praying is a powerful discipline in the life of a Christian, and therefore I advise you to kneel and pray as often as you can within a day, hopefully more than once. The second work of faith that I will discuss is fasting. Depriving your body of food and drink for a period of consecration unto the Lord is a very important work of faith that should be a habit in the lives of all believers. Continued the pastor. Claire wrote this down in her notebook. She had read these verses in the book of James before but had never been taught its application in such a forward manner. The third work of faith we will discuss is paying your tithes and offerings to the house of God. It is a great act of obedience to give the tenth of your substance to the church. Adding an offering to your tithe would be an act of worship, and such faith is precious in the sight of the Lord. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. We read these words in Hebrews chapter 7 verse 1. I therefore conclude that pure obedience to the law of God is akin to pure and undefiled faith in the Godhead, Father, Spirit, and Son. Preached Pastor Avery while Claire wrote down his words in her notebook. Now we will look at personal and interpersonal works of faith. Interpersonal works of faith involve your conduct of dress and manner of speech with your fellow man. Our manner of dress is what I will begin to address. I appreciate that many women have entered this chapel with veils over their hair this morning. I prefer that women always cover their hair thus. We read in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 5 that a woman praying or prophesying with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Therefore Christian women who live a life of prayer and dedication to God ought to cover their hair at all times. Pastor Avery smiled at the women in the front after he said that. Claire was careful to write all of this down. Likewise, a man praying or prophesying with his head covered dishonors his head. Therefore I advise men to take off their hats during church service and prayer. I will now declare to the congregation a more proper way of dressing. I prefer women to wear gowns and long dresses, as well as to cover their hair at all times. Women who profess the Christian faith must not wear jewelry or makeup, as the origins of such items are pagan. Men should neither wear any jewelry, makeup or any other adornments that could denote to vanity. In changing our manner of dress we come separate from the world, as is the commandment given to all Christians in the first book of John, chapter 2 verse 15, Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Now to address Christian speech. Speak truthfully and do not invent fables or exaggerate facts, because fables and exaggerations are nothing more than lies. Do not use curse words and do not use the name of God in vain. He paused and looked up from his notes. These are the words, that if you do them and heed my sermon, you will be a pleasing vessel of worship before the God of heaven. Thank you for your time and attention, good day. Concluded Pastor Avery and bowed while the congregation gave an enormous applause. Claire stood up and clapped with everyone else. This sermon truly was a sermon that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Pastor Avery left the stage and the school choir closed the service with a wonderful rendition of Nearer My God to Thee. After the church service, Claire jogged towards the kitchen to assist in preparing supper for the students. She thought she would pay a visit to Mr. Appleton later that day, as she saw him walking to his cottage. They served the lunch for the children, after which Claire ran off to Mr. Appleton's cottage before anyone could notice that she was gone. She knocked on his door and heard him walking towards the door soon after her knock. "Good day, Mr. Appleton," greeted Claire as soon as he opened the door. "Good day, Miss Claire, please come in," answered Mr. Appleton. The cottage was still warm from the fireplace that had probably been burning all through the night. It smelled like fresh carrot soup and honey. He had turned this cottage into a home indeed. Claire walked to the living room near the fireplace and sat on one of the sofas. He sat down on the opposite sofa after he had closed the door. She stared at the pictures on his wall in search of a topic to begin their conversation with. "How did you find the sermon that Pastor Avery delivered, ma'am?" he asked, clearing the air. "It was lovely, and demanding a greater level of holiness from all of us who claim the Christian faith," replied Claire as she thought on his sermon. "Much of the laws of holiness expose the amount of filth and impure items sold to women. Much more so than those sold to men," she continued as she remembered the amount of makeup and jewelry she had bought at small corner stores for very little money. The sad reality is that society is slowly being geared to a point where we need to adorn ourselves with such pagan articles in order to be decent or acceptable towards others," he said, running his hand through his beard as he thought on this. "I know for a fact that women think makeup is a requirement for marriage. My mother would tell me that I had to work hard so that I could afford to buy lipstick someday. She would tell me that no man would marry me with my pale pink lips," laughed Claire as she remembered the amount of lipstick her mother would apply to her mouth before she left to go anywhere. Mr. Appleton laughed about this and wanted to know more of Claire's family. "What was your family like?" he asked as he leaned over to place his elbows on his knees. "Home? My family? Well, it's been so long ago since I have seen any of them. My mother is the liveliest person I've ever known. She always had a great number of friends and would often bring me and my sister to the many balls and weddings she'd be invited to. We'd wear wonderful dresses that my grandmother would make for us out of old curtains. People would think we were rich cause of how lovely our clothes were, but we were the poorest people I knew. My father, well, he worked on a farm far away from home. He would bring a lot of fruit and vegetables every time he came home. We would wait for my father's returns from the farm with such anticipation because we didn't have much to eat when he wasn't home," remembered Claire longingly. Mr. Appleton laughed at the colorful interpretation Claire gave of her earlier life. "I miss the green meadows and snowball fights in winter more than anything. My home is in Ireland. I came to England when I was 17. Anyway, we had many pets. Well, my mother loved animals and we took in whatever stray we found. We would build dog houses with old carton boxes we collected at grocery shops. My favorite cat was Crystal. She slept on my pillow every night. She would curl up on my pillow and fall asleep with her head in my hair." "Have you ever been to Ireland, Mr. Appleton?" asked Claire while the fond memories of her humble childhood were coming back to her. "Once, in Dublin. Was only there for a few days when I was young. My father worked there and we visited him," answered Mr. Appleton. "Your father worked in Dublin? Why didn't you move there to stay with him?" asked Claire, a bit puzzled. "Well, he had never married my mother. She was a fling he had in France and I came of it. Soon he married a wealthy Irish woman and I wasn't allowed to visit him anymore. My mother said that it would be a shame if I did," said Mr. Appleton, folding his hands. "A shame?" asked Claire, trying to look into his eyes. "Yes, Miss Claire, a shame. I was a bastard, a child born to an unwed woman who sold bread for a living. In those days, bastard children were a shame to their parents," continued Mr. Appleton, trying hard to look at Claire as he said that. Claire thought about all that he had just said for a while. She had definitely heard of a few bastard children who were disowned by one of their parents, but never had she talked to one about the matter. Claire also figured out that wasn't the reason that his mother kept him away from his father, but she didn't think he understood that. She smiled at him, hoping to exude enough kindness to cover the shame that he must have felt. He wouldn't look up at her no matter how much she tried making eye contact with him. He was looking directly at his hands, a bit too intently at them perhaps. "How did you meet your wife, the lady in this picture?" asked Claire as she walked over to the picture of his wife with their baby in her arms. He smiled and looked up to the picture Claire was referring to. "Julienne. We met at the markets. I was selling my mother's bread at the market and Julienne came to buy a few buns of bread. She came back every day to buy the same buns of bread and that was how we became friends. One day I visited her house and saw her kitchen filled with my mother's bread buns. It was amazing. She told me that she didn't come to the market to buy bread. She came to see me," said Mr. Appleton, almost laughing at the memory. Claire laughed at that and kept looking at the beautiful picture of Julienne and their son. How could she have known what little time she had left? Does a smiling woman ever realize that precious time is about to run out? "I bought her wedding dress with my first paycheck. I used to work at a car dealership in France. It was a lovely time, getting married to the girl who bought my mother's bread," laughed Mr. Appleton with deep longing in his eyes. Claire knew the tragic ending of that story. She didn't want him to have to tell her about Julienne's death all over again. "All right, Mr. Appleton, I must be off. It was lovely chatting with you, sir," said Claire as she stopped him before he could continue. He nodded his head and seemed to understand why she had interrupted him. He walked her to the door and they said their farewells. As Claire walked to their boarding home, she saw Mary Beth running towards the boarding home. "What are you doing outside at this time of day, Mary Beth?" yelled Claire, and the girl stopped running. She ran towards Claire in the same speed and determination. She seemed very frightened as her big blue eyes were popping out of her face. "I heard something very bad, Miss Claire, it's awful," cried Mary Beth as tears streamed down her little face. Claire took her in her arms and tried to console the child. Mary Beth probably went to Mr. Cunningham's house, judging by where she was coming from. "Did you go to their house again, Mary Beth?" asked Claire. "Yes," replied the little girl as she wiped her tears. "Mary Beth Weaver, do you know how dangerous that is?" exclaimed Claire, very sure that the little girl had no idea of what danger she had put herself in. "He said that 2 of the people were dead by the time the truck reached the border. Before then he instructed his criminals to seal the people in big trucks that will be locked at all times. They are selling people, Miss Claire, and some of those people die before they get fresh air again," blurted Mary Beth through her heavy sobs. Claire remembered the fishing truck that she and Ashley had knocked on. She knew it was a very dark topic that put a woman of Ashley's age to tears. How would little Mary Beth handle the reality of human traffic? "Go to the dorm, Mary Beth, it's getting dark out here," replied Claire, not sure how any human being handles such a matter. She tried hard to fall asleep that night but couldn't. The pain of what little Mary Beth heard that night stabbed at her. Why was she so disturbed by the tears of Mary Beth? Perhaps because all the people that would be trafficked in those fishing trucks would be crying the same tears. Her mouth was dry, her throat more so. Tomorrow and every day after that would be a frightening day, since she didn't know if anyone on the campus was safe or a potential victim. What if Ashley tells the wrong person about this? The following afternoon Claire and Miriam took large baskets from the storeroom to collect pears from Mr. Appleton's gardens. As they got to the gardens they saw Mr. Appleton watering the roses. He gave them such great care that they blossomed wonderfully that spring. "Good afternoon, Mr. Appleton. We came to collect pears for the students," yelled Claire as she waved at him with a basket in her other hand. "Miss Claire and Miss Miriam, come and pick as many pears as you need," yelled Mr. Appleton from his garden. Claire gasped at the amount of pears hanging from the trees all over his gardens. Spring had never been so beautiful at the Cunningham boarding school. "The gardens look lovely this spring, Mr. Appleton," remarked Miriam as soon as they arrived. "Yes, ma'am, the gardens of spring are what I live for. Once the snow has melted and watered the earth, my gardens truly come alive," replied Mr. Appleton as he took in the beautiful sight. Claire started picking pears and realized that she would need a ladder to get the best ones. Miriam had thought of that and had sent one of the students to get a ladder from the trade class earlier. "Mr. Lockwood Thorne was here this morning. He said I should tell you to be ready by 7. Said Mr. Appleton as he walked over to Claire. Her heart started beating faster when she heard him mention Lockwood Thorne. She had gone bright red and started giggling a bit. This made her feel like she was a teenager all over again. "Really? A date?" she giggled, throwing her hand over her mouth. "I must get dressed, it's almost 7 o'clock. Exclaimed Claire and ran to the boarding home, dropping the basket on the ground. Mr. Appleton and Miriam laughed at this and continued picking pears from the trees. Claire had a quick shower and washed her hair. She went through all her dresses but couldn't find the one that would be perfect to wear. She remembered the words of Pastor Avery and decided to wear a purple gown with a floral veil over her hair. She wore her silver flat shoes and thought they looked pretty smart with her purple dress. She was sure that Mr. Lockwood Thorne would tell her how much he loved her as well and how he would marry her as soon as she said yes. She was sure that she would be happy as his wife, a wife. She would be a detective's wife and people would respect her, she would have more money to spend and she would have many beautiful children. "Claire, Miriam's calling you," yelled one of the governesses from down the hall. Claire quickly locked up the cupboard and threw one of her old jerseys over her dress. It was still a bit chilly after all. Claire ran out of the dorm and saw Miriam walking towards the dorm with a large basket of pears in her hand. "Now you're lucky Mr. Appleton helped me collect pears after you had run off today. I could never have done all that work by myself," said Miriam as she fanned her face with one hand. "Why did you call me Miriam? Is he here?" asked Claire. "Yes, Mr. Lockwood Thorne is at the gardens with Mr. Appleton. He's asking for you," replied Miriam. Claire ran towards the gardens upon hearing this. Perhaps she was a bit more excited about this than she should have been. When she arrived at the gardens she saw Mr. Lockwood Thorne and Mr. Appleton watching her walk towards them. Mr. Appleton returned to watering his plants and Claire turned to face Mr. Lockwood Thorne. "How have you been?" asked Mr. Lockwood Thorne, smiling politely as he did. "Very well, sir, it's a lovely day, isn't it?" replied Claire, trying to catch his gaze. Mr. Lockwood Thorne kept looking at the tree beside them without saying a word. "Would you join me for dinner, ma'am?" he asked, finally turning to look at Claire. "Yes, sir, I would love to," responded Claire without the slightest hesitation. He reached out his arm for her to take and they walked off to his car. Claire smiled, she was so happy that this was happening. He opened her door for her and she got into his car. They drove out of the school grounds and onto the highway. "How long have you had this car?" asked Claire in an attempt to strike up a conversation with him. "For 2 years now. It still runs smoothly, doesn't it?" he replied as he focused on the road. "It does. agreed Claire, and they both laughed very nervously after that. They drove through the city and finally down a long road that led to a beautiful estate with a very high gate. He stopped his car at the gate and a little boy ran to open the gate. Claire thought he was very young for a servant boy, a bit too young perhaps. They drove into the estate and parked the car near a large terrain. Mr. Lockwood Thorne got out of the car and ran to open Claire's door for her. She got out of the car and looked all around her at the beautiful estate she had been brought to. "Please follow me to the house, ma'am," said Lockwood Thorne as he led the way. Claire hurriedly tried to keep up with him as he walked towards his mansion. Once they arrived to the porch, a little girl ran up to Mr. Lockwood Thorne. "Daddy! Daddy! What did you bring me?" yelled the little girl as Mr. Lockwood Thorne picked her up and spun her around. "It's hiding somewhere behind this ear," joked Lockwood Thorne as he hid a large coin behind one of her ears. She discovered the coin and kissed her father joyfully. It was such a lovely sight that Claire could only smile at it. Soon a heavily pregnant woman walked out of the house in a large apron. Claire had no idea what any of this meant, she didn't seem to be making sense of it yet. "Sweetheart, you brought a guest today. Well, I'll tell Juanita to prepare a seat for her then," she said, and soon afterwards kissed the detective. He embraced her and Claire could feel her heart drop through her chest to her feet. It was the hardest realization to make. He had brought her to meet his wife and daughter. Soon the boy that had opened the gate ran towards the house yelling, "Mom! Dad brought a lady for dinner!" he yelled as he ran up to them. It was his son. Good grief, the man had a family that Claire had no idea about. She felt very light-headed, almost dizzy. Claire placed her hand over her chest and pressed hard against it, almost as if she could protect her heart from breaking by holding onto it. His wife noticed how uneasy Claire looked and decided to introduce herself. "Good afternoon, ma'am, my name is Christiana Lockwood Thorne. Welcome to our home. This is Harper and Jeremy. We have two others in the house, Daniel and Juanita are twins, busy setting the table as I speak. I hope you like turkey, cause that is what we'll be having for dinner," she said, not sure who this woman was or how to address her. Claire tried to smile at her kind greeting and looked at Detective Lockwood Thorne with confusion. He understood how uncomfortable Claire must have felt and took his wife aside. "Take the children to the house with you, dear, we will join you shortly," said the detective and gave his wife a kiss before she left. Mr. Lockwood Thorne turned towards Claire, who was completely pale by now. "Please follow me to the gardens, ma'am," he said as he beckoned for Claire to follow him. She walked behind him in silence as she struggled to make sense of the situation that she found herself in. They reached a very lovely garden and Claire was overwhelmed by how extravagant his house was. What a wealthy man he must have been. The garden was breathtaking and its beauty was exalted by a huge fountain in its center. She sat down on a bench, but Lockwood Thorne kept pacing around the garden. "I didn't know of any other way to let you understand why I could not return your affections," he said, trying to contemplate the distress that she must have been in. "You are a very cruel man," replied Claire, looking at her feet as a tear dropped down one of her eyes. "Miss Claire, these are situations that you need to address as a reasonable and grown woman. What interest would a man of my position have in a common governess, not much more than a servant?" he said as he tried hard to make sense of the situation. Claire felt the stab of that statement pierce through her entire being. "You could think of no other way in which to express your disdain of me," she said as tears ran down her face more violently. He walked towards her and thought he would wipe her tears away with his hand. He thought better of it and passed her a tissue instead. She tried her hardest not to look into his eyes as she grabbed the tissue from his hand. He kneeled down beside her. "I did not intend to insult you. I had no idea how I would let you know of my wife in any other way," he said as he tried to console her. Claire sat very still as Detective Lockwood Thorne was kneeled down before her. She felt afraid of him because of the amount of pain she had felt because of him. He noticed her emotional distance from him and stood up after a while. "Join us for dinner, I'd like for you to meet my family," he concluded and walked off towards the house. Claire sat there and wept. The beauty of the water fountain beside her did nothing to lift her mood, and she wept bitterly that night. She attempted to wipe her tears with the inside of her jersey so that no one would see that she had been crying. She stood up and pulled her dress into place while she walked towards the house. Claire was sure that they were all expecting her to join them, and she had to pull herself together so that none of them would notice a thing. She was sure that Lockwood Thorne would not tell his wife of this, and that put her at ease. Upon entering the house, its magnificence and splendor took her breath away. The carpets were very clean for a couple who had young children. Claire heard their chatter down the hall, and she followed the sound of their voices. She found them in a big dining hall with an enormous chandelier hanging right above them. Lockwood Thorne was indeed a very wealthy man to afford a house of such unrivaled extravagance. "Come sit next to me, here," said Harper, the little girl that had jumped into her father's arms earlier. Harper tried with all her strength to pull out the chair next to hers so that Claire could sit on it. Claire hurriedly ran to help the little girl pull out the chair and sat down on it. She smiled at everybody around her. She tried hard to make it look authentic when she did. They were all completely unaware of what had happened earlier, and Claire tried her hardest to pretend that she hadn't been crying. The diner went by quite well, and Claire did manage to laugh at one or two of Harper's many jokes. The tension between her and Lockwood Thorne was like an invisible wall that no one else was aware of. As soon as they were done with dessert, the detective drove her back to the boarding home. The tension between them was so thick that neither of them said a word throughout the entire journey. They arrived at the boarding home and found the gate closed. Mr. Lockwood Thorne got off to open Claire's door and let her out. "Good night," she said, and turned to walk to the boarding home through the hole in the fence that was her only option at that time. "Miss Claire," said Lockwood Thorne as he ran towards her. "I've found out that 3 trucks said to be conveying fish will arrive at the school tomorrow. I don't know what time or if it's true what I heard," continued Lockwood Thorne. Claire got a shock when she heard that. The reality of Cunningham's illegal activity woke her up from the self-pity she had fallen into. The danger she was in was all too real, and she turned to face the detective. "I need you to call me when they arrive. Here is some money for the payphone," he said, and he took a few dollar notes out of his wallet. "Coins? The payphone only takes coins," interjected Claire as she watched him taking the banknotes out of his wallet. "All right, wait here," he said as he put the money back into his wallet. He ran towards the car and got some coins off of the dashboard. "Here, I suppose these would be enough," he said, running back to her with the coins in his hand. "Don't get anywhere near those trucks. Call me the moment they arrive. I'll bring some back up," he continued, looking into her eyes and trying to convey the danger of the situation to her. "What will happen to this place when Mr. Cunningham gets caught?" asked Claire, her future survival an uncertain one. "I'm not sure yet. Students will probably be sent home," replied Lockwood Thorne. "But not to worry, I'll look out for you. I have a friend who runs a mission. I'll talk to him when I get a chance to," continued the detective as he tried to put her at ease. She was grateful for that. Her night's agony would most probably never be forgotten, but he would take care of her, and that was of some comfort to her. She smiled at him and walked off towards the boarding home. Every step she took was more difficult than the one she took before it. How could anyone ever mend from such a thing? She got to the dorm room and got into her nightgown. It was going to be a long night of dwelling on everything that had happened. She didn't make a noise, her tears would be silent tears. It would be hard if any of the girls woke up and asked her why she was crying. "A song for thee, my Saviour King, is what I live for, Jesus Christ." Claire opened her eyes when she heard those words. Ashley was going through her cupboard and singing that song. It was such a fond memory from so long ago. Claire remembered singing that song in grade school back in Ireland. It was like all those years rushing back to her in that one moment. She woke up and got dressed to the sound of Ashley's singing. She didn't say a word since the heavy cloud of last night still hung over her head. And I know, that I live, because thou makest intercession for me. I'm born again, I'm born again. Redeemed on the cross of Calvary. Sang Ashley as she opened the windows. Claire saw the card of Lockwood Thorne on her dresser and put it into her pocket. She remembered that she had to call him as soon as the fishing trucks arrived. Then the dreadful anticipation for that day began. More people would probably be in those fishing trucks. How would she keep Mary Beth away from the inevitable confrontation between Lockwood Thorne and Cunningham? Would there be gunshot? What would happen to Mr. Appleton's gardens? She thought of Mr. Appleton and knew that she had to warn him of the events that would likely unfold that day. She grabbed the coins that Lockwood Thorne had given her and put them in her jersey pocket. She wasn't going to carry a purse, the day was too tense for her to be carrying a purse. Claire took a pair of curtains to hang at the school in one of the classrooms. It would be her excuse to talk to Mary Beth. She knew that Mary Beth was in 5th grade and that the children from 5th grade were probably the rowdiest in the school, so she didn't look forward to that one bit. She read the class registers against the wall near one of the staircases and found out that Mary Beth would be at the sports hall for physical training. She walked to the sports hall carrying the curtains and looking around her for any hint of the fish trucks. She entered the gym and found Mary Beth after a brief search. She took her aside immediately. "We need to talk, Mary Beth, come with me immediately," said Claire, taking Mary Beth by the hand. They walked to the hallway, to a corner where they wouldn't be heard. "I don't want you going to Cunningham's house anymore. Do you understand that, Mary Beth?" said Claire in an urgent tone. "Why?" asked Mary Beth. "It is dangerous, especially today," replied Claire. "What's going to happen today?" asked Mary Beth, perplexed. "Something very bad. More fish trucks will arrive today. I want you to run to a classroom the moment you see one of them. Tell everyone to run to their classrooms and lock their doors. This is going to be a dangerous day, Mary Beth," said Claire as her voice shook. Mary Beth nodded her head. She understood the gravity of the situation very well. "Did you tell Detective What's-his-name about this?" asked Mary Beth. "He was the one who told me about the fish trucks arriving today," answered Claire and paused for a while. "Why would you ask that?" continued Claire. "Because you had kept the information you knew of Cunningham from him when I met you at the gardens in town. I could tell that you had deceived him, and I think he figured it out as well," replied Mary Beth, recalling their encounter in town. Claire didn't think much about that. It didn't matter now. "I need to get back to class, Miss Claire," said Mary Beth as she looked over to the children in the gym. "All right, off with you," said Claire, and Mary Beth ran off to join her classmates in the gym. Her childhood innocence perhaps protecting her mind from the danger they were in. Claire hung one of the curtains right next to the ones that were already there. She didn't think that anyone would notice how out of place it looked. The bell rang and the children switched classrooms. Claire decided to tell Mr. Appleton about all that was going to happen soon. She ran to his gardens and opened the gate. He looked at her as she entered his garden, wondering about what she was in such a hurry for. "Mr. Appleton, you must go to your cottage until I let you know when it's safe to come out again," yelled Claire, trying to convey the urgency of the matter. "Why? Is something going to happen?" asked Mr. Appleton. She didn't answer him, not knowing how much about this she should tell him. He looked at the nervous condition Claire was in and moved closer to ask her of her state. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked. "I don't know, I'm scared and anxious. Trucks will be arriving, things might get very dangerous. Please go to your cottage till it's over, Mr. Appleton, I'll let you know when it is," said Claire as the anticipation of those trucks became more frightful for her. She kept looking at the gate and the road leading up to it. When would they arrive? "All right, ma'am, I'll be off," he said and went to get the tools he'd been working with. He stopped for a moment and turned to Claire. "How are you feeling, after yesterday?" asked Mr. Appleton. Claire figured he knew. She remembered that he was in the gardens with Lockwood Thorne before she had arrived. Her mouth became very dry as she stared at him. I told him to let me tell you about his wife. He said it would be best if he did it himself, said Mr. Appleton, still looking intently at Claire. How did you know about his wife? Asked Claire in a softer tone. He told me that he was going to introduce you to her. I told him that was cruel, but he replied saying that it would be harder for him to tell you any other way. Then you showed up and I returned to tending the garden, said Mr. Appleton, looking at the flower bed beside them. Claire didn't say a thing, so Mr. Appleton got his tools and left. Why didn't Mr. Lockwood Thorne let him tell her? Why did he think it was necessary for her to experience such humiliation? Why didn't he tell her before she got into his car? Did he do such a thing for sport? She could feel no hatred for a man she loved so much and decided not to dwell on it any further. Claire turned to walk towards the boarding home. She thought she should get something to eat since the anticipation for the day's events had kept her from eating anything. As she walked to the boarding house, she looked towards the gate one last time. That's when she saw the trucks. They were driving through the gate that two of the senior boys had opened. Claire knew she had to find Mary Beth fast and ran towards the school as fast as she could. She saw Mary Beth playing hopscotch with two of her friends. It was probably recess for the pupils. Claire ran up to them and called Mary Beth aside. Come Mary Beth, hurry! Yelled Claire, and Mary Beth ran towards where she was. Are they here? Asked the child. Yes, tell your friends to help you get the students into their classes or whatever classroom that's open. Hurry, said Claire in great panic and ran to the payphone afterwards. Mary Beth told her friends of the danger and what they had to do. They split up and ran to tell as many students as they could to get into any classroom they could and lock the doors. Claire reached the payphone and pulled a few coins out of her pocket. She didn't care to know how much each was worth and pushed 3 of them into the payphone. She dialed the number on his card and it rang for a few minutes. Come on, she said as she looked around her. Where would those fishing trucks be parked and how many people were in them? How long had they gone without anything to eat? These thoughts went through her mind as she stood there. Hello, said the voice of Lockwood Thorne. They're here, all 3 trucks. 2 of the senior boys opened the gate to let them in and many of the students are running for cover in their classrooms as I speak, said Claire, anticipating for the worst to happen that day. All right, I'm on my way. Could you lock the gate? Asked the detective. I think the boys closed it, but I don't know if it's locked, replied Claire as she gripped onto the phone tighter. Doesn't matter much, we'll have the place surrounded. I need you to stay away from all that is about to happen, Claire. Return to the boarding home and lock yourself in a room, said Lockwood Thorne over the phone. All right, I'm off, replied Claire and hung up the phone. Claire ran to the boarding home. She had to find Ashley as soon as she could. She got to their room and found Ashley and Miriam in there. We mustn't leave this room, said Claire and turned around to lock the door. Whatever do you mean, Claire? I need to hang the laundry that I just did. Luckily Ashley agreed to help me with this, said Miriam, perplexed by Claire's behavior. We can hang it later, now is a very dangerous time to go outside, yelled Claire, running to the window to see what was happening outside. It all still looked calm. A few seniors were on the lawn and she wondered how many students did make it to their classes when Mary Beth and her friends warned them. It's about the fishing truck, isn't it? Said Ashley. Claire turned to look at her and nodded her head. Ashley swallowed hard, understanding at last why Claire was in such panic. What is going on? Asked Miriam, unaware of the silent conversation between Ashley and Claire. This school is a drug and human traffic port. Detective Lockwood Thorne plans on ending that today, answered Claire, and soon after that returned to looking through the window. No one said a word after that. Then Claire saw Catherine outside. She was carrying an empty basket which she was probably going to fill with some fruit from Mr. Appleton's gardens. "Catherine! Catherine, come back!" yelled Claire through the window. She didn't seem to hear her and kept walking towards the gardens. Claire knew that she had to do something fast. "Lock the door after I leave, don't come after me," said Claire and unlocked the door to run after Catherine. "Hurry back!" yelled Ashley after Claire. She ran down the stairs and through the corridor. "Go to your rooms, Edith, Jane!" yelled Claire once she got downstairs. "What on earth?" asked Jane, holding a tray of muffins she had baked for the students. "Just do it, Jane, it's urgent," continued Claire. She ran outside and came to the students on the lawn, probably skipping class. Looking around her, she saw the police vans surrounding the school. Lockwood Thorne had arrived and she needed to get Catherine to take cover fast. "Get to your classrooms, don't sit on the lawn. Go to your classes at once," she yelled, and the students started getting up and going to class, talking loudly about the police vans as they did. Claire ran to the garden to find Catherine. She was merrily picking grapes from the vines when Claire reached her. "Catherine, do you not notice the police vans surrounding the school?" asked Claire when she had finally reached her. "Yes, I see them. I wonder what they're here for. Don't the grapes look lovely? I told Mr. Appleton that I liked these green ones a lot," replied Catherine, blissfully unaware of what was going on. Claire pulled her aside and decided they would hide in the gardens behind the large rose bushes. Catherine naturally had many questions about what it was that Claire was doing, but was told that they had to remain very quiet. "We found the trucks, they're all sealed shut, and we managed to arrest 2 of the teachers who were told to keep watch over them. There are obviously more people involved," said one of the officers when he reached Lockwood Thorne. "Break them open, make sure you don't injure anyone in them," replied Lockwood Thorne, looking around him. The officers and a few soldiers started drilling on the trucks, and its occupants began screaming, wondering what it was that was happening. Once the trucks were opened, they were freed, many of them starving and sickly looking. A few of them had died, and the ones that were alive had gone at least 3 days without food and water. A lot of drugs, ammunition, and electronic goods were discovered in those fishing trucks. The reality of Cunningham's dealings was a dark one. The police officers arrested a few of Mr. Cunningham's accomplices, and naturally some denied having any knowledge of the transaction. Claire saw the victims as they were being led to the ambulance vans and others being carried away on stretchers. She figured it was safe for them to leave their hiding place, and Claire walked towards Lockwood Thorne while Catherine went back to picking grapes. "How many victims did you save?" asked Claire once she had reached him. "Didn't count. Claire, you need to be indoors, hiding away from this. We still need to arrest Cunningham, and my men say he's locked himself in his house with his family, threatening to kill them all," said the detective, very anxious at the reality of what was going on. Claire followed Lockwood Thorne to Cunningham's house with 3 other detectives. His house was surrounded with police officers. All the doors were locked and the windows were pulled shut. "Don't come in here. I'll shoot you all," yelled Cunningham as one of the detectives tried conversing with him. "Detective Lockwood Thorne, we found a boy that can pick locks. He says he can open the back door and we could enter the house that way," said one of the police officers as he presented a young boy still in his school uniform to Lockwood Thorne. "All right, take 3 officers with you. I'll distract him through conversation," said Lockwood Thorne. Claire watched the scene that was unfolding in front of her like she was watching a movie. "Cunningham! Let your wife and children go. We're only here for you," yelled Lockwood Thorne over a loudspeaker. "Stand back! Stand back or I'll shoot them all!" yelled Cunningham, his wife and his children audibly crying as he said that. "It doesn't have to end this way, Cunningham. With a good lawyer you could negotiate a more lenient sentence and avoid capital punishment," continued Lockwood Thorne over the loudspeaker, not sure how to keep this conversation going. "You're lying to me. yelled Cunningham, sounding more desperate. A few minutes of the hopeless conversation between Lockwood Thorne and Cunningham passed by and it seemed that they weren't making any progress. Then an officer ran to them from the back of the house where the boy had been picking the lock. "We got it open," 2 officers went in, "but we think they're locked in his bedroom," he said as he reported their progress to the detective. "Good, I'm on my way. Claire, I need your help," said Lockwood Thorne, turning towards Claire. "My help?" asked Claire, startled by this. "Yes, I need you to engage into a conversation with him. Talk of anything, we need time," said the detective, handing over the loudspeaker to Claire. Claire took it and stood there, not sure how to begin this conversation or why so much trust had been put into her hands. She began to arrange the words in her mind. "Mr. Cunningham, do you remember Pastor Avery? He came to talk to us of." "Yes, I know who he is. I was the one who invited him here. What does that have to do with anything?" interrupted Mr. Cunningham. "In his sermon, Pastor Avery said that pure obedience to the law of God is akin with pure and undefiled faith in the Godhead," continued Claire, praying in her heart that God would give her the correct words to say. Cunningham kept quiet. He didn't know where this was going, so he thought he'd listen and not speak. "Christianity is an act of faith in Jesus. Therefore you cannot claim to be a Christian if you are disobedient to the law of God. I believe God can forgive you of these sins and restore your faith if you obey His law from henceforth," concluded Claire, not sure if her attempt was any good. "God could never forgive the evil that I have done," yelled Cunningham, in tears by the sound of it. Just then Lockwood Thorne and his men broke through the door of the room where Cunningham had been hiding with his family. "Throw your weapon to the ground. Right here before my feet. We have you surrounded," yelled Lockwood Thorne with his gun pointed towards Cunningham. At least 5 other officers with their guns drawn ran into the room almost immediately after Lockwood Thorne. "Do as he says," yelled one of the officers after a few minutes. Claire stood in anticipation, not knowing what was going on in the house. Cunningham put his gun to his head. "Remember what she said," interrupted his wife, in tears as she said that. "God can forgive your sins if you will humble yourself and obey His law," she continued, almost pleading with him. Cunningham looked at his wife, then at all the officers with their guns drawn. He looked around him, still holding the gun to his head. "You don't want to do that, no one does," said Lockwood Thorne in a softer tone. Cunningham closed his eyes. He had thought things through and knew what he was going to do. He opened them and threw his gun at Lockwood Thorne's feet. "I choose obedience to God's law," he said, weeping as he did. His wife was so greatly relieved when he said that, it was a peaceful surrender. He turned around and the officers cuffed him. He would probably spend the rest of his life in jail, but he would spend those years in obedience to the divine law of God. His family was taken in for questioning in order for officers to know more of his illegal dealings. Cunningham was taken to prison and the institution would be shut within 5 days. Only time would tell if anyone would ever open it again. Claire packed her suitcase as she watched students running to the arms of their parents just outside her window. She would be driving off to the Christian mission in town later that day. Lockwood Thorne had found work for her and Ashley at the mission. Ashley wasn't very optimistic about that, but Claire was very glad about getting a new place to sleep. She didn't want them to pay her, she was honored to be serving the church and would have done it for free. Miriam would be going to the house of one of her grandchildren and by the sound of it they had arrived. "There comes my Mandy, I could recognize their orange truck a mile away," said Miriam as she watched the orange truck drive up the driveway and park near one of the many cars. "Goodbye Miriam, take care," said Claire and ran up to Miriam to hug her. They embraced and Ashley joined them in the embrace. After that Claire and Ashley offered to carry her luggage to the truck. They walked to the truck reminiscing of all the years they had spent there. Her son-in-law loaded her luggage onto the truck as they were saying their goodbyes. "And I'll never forget Mr. Appleton's gardens. Give a farewell to him for me," concluded Miriam as she closed her door. "We will, Miriam, goodbye," waved Claire as Miriam drove away. "Can you believe that I never thought this day would come?" said Ashley as they waved at Miriam. "Me neither, I honestly thought I'd be growing old here, eating from Mr. Appleton's many gardens," replied Claire, looking fondly at the apple trees that had finally come to life after many years. "I wonder who's going to eat from his gardens when everyone finally leaves," pondered Ashley as she watched a few schoolboys plucking some oranges off of one of the orange trees. Claire wondered about that as well, how his gardens would look like after years of no human contact. This place would probably become a historical site full of cobwebs and mice. "I must see Mr. Appleton one more time, come with me, Ashley," said Claire. Ashley agreed to the idea and they walked to his cabin at the back of the school. They knocked on his door and he came to open it after just a few knocks. When Claire saw him, she noticed that he was dressed and ready to depart. "Good day, Miss Claire, Miss Ashley," greeted Mr. Appleton as he let them in. They walked into his cottage and saw all his suitcases packed and all the pictures taken from the walls. The furniture was neat and tidy and it would probably remain that way till the school reopened again someday and other people abode there. "Where will you be going, Mr. Appleton?" asked Claire, looking at his suitcases. "I will return to France, plant my own gardens and watch them grow," he said, a smile embracing his face at the thought. "I'd love to visit you in France someday, say when, and I'll come," suggested Claire with excitement. "Wonderful, come visit me anytime. Let me give you my address," he said as he tore a clean page out of a notebook and wrote it down. "This is my address. I would greatly look forward to receiving your letters, Miss Claire," he said as he handed her the page. Claire was very excited about that and immediately put the page in her pocket. "I'll write it down for you later," said Claire as she turned to Ashley. "I don't write letters," replied Ashley, confused by Claire's gesture. "Common, you must have written love letters before," joked Mr. Appleton. "Nope, couldn't read till I was 22 years old," replied Ashley. Claire wondered about Ashley's upbringing after she had said that. She didn't know what it was like not to read and she loved the freedom of knowing what people were saying without having to listen. The girls chatted with Mr. Appleton until he left for the train station. They returned to finish packing their bags after that visit and waited for Lockwood Thorne's arrival. "Do you think I should wear this dress?" asked Ashley as she drew a long, silver dress out of her suitcase. "Too shiny, it will look like we are off to a party. Rather add a jersey to what you're wearing now," remarked Claire as she looked at the dress. Ashley folded that dress back into her suitcase and withdrew a neat grey jersey instead. Suddenly there was a knock on the door and Claire went to open it. "Miss Claire, Detective Lockwood Thorne is downstairs calling for you," said the female student that had come to deliver the announcement. She nodded her head and the girl left. The heavy feeling of their conversation in the garden was still at the back of her mind. It had seemed like her happy ending was only a dream. Whether she would be a wife and mother after such disappointment was something she did not want to think about. She walked downstairs with her suitcases and he loaded them onto his car. They drove to the mission as soon as Ashley joined them. "I really hope you like it there. My friend Pastor Lincoln said you are more than welcome at his mission," said Detective Lockwood Thorne while they drove to the mission. "What kind of work will we be doing there?" asked Ashley, not thrilled by it at all. "Well, at your level you'll be working in the soup kitchen or children's ministry. I'm sure the longer you have been there and the more biblical knowledge you acquire, greater responsibility will be placed into your hands, like going on actual mission trips," explained Lockwood Thorne, driving into the large driveway of the Christian mission. "I'm glad you have brought us here. It is a wonderful privilege to serve in the Church of God and we will make the most of it," said Claire, very optimistic about her new life in the work of the Lord. They got out of the car and took in the large building of the Christian mission. Mission of Christ was its name and they were soon directed to their rooms. They shared a room with 2 other Christian women whom they received their daily schedules from. Claire felt much more at home within that Christian mission than she had ever felt anywhere she had lived. She worked in the soup kitchen and they would often hand out clothes and blankets to homeless and poor people. Claire also found out that Pastor Avery served at that mission and would often converse with him when he would take his walks through the garden. The mission garden was large and beautiful, probably more beautiful than Mr. Appleton's gardens. Volunteers and school students would water the garden every day and it flourished. One day as Claire was picking roses from the garden for the flower vases in the mission, she saw Pastor Avery sitting on one of the benches in the garden. She thought she would walk over to him and hear how his day had been. "Good morning, Pastor Avery," said Claire as she walked up to him with the roses in her hand. "Good morning, Miss Claire, please have a seat," said Pastor Avery as he cleared his notebooks from the bench and put them on the ground. Claire sat on the bench beside him, wondering what it was that he was writing about. "Miss Claire, have you ever gone fishing?" he asked as he turned to her. "Well, yes, Pastor Avery. Many times," replied Claire. Pastor Avery smiled at that, bouncing the edge of his pen against the Bible he had on his lap. "Why? Would you like to go fishing?" asked Claire, presuming that was why he asked the question. Pastor Avery laughed at that. "No, not today at least. I was just thinking about my sermon tomorrow. Tell me, Miss Claire, how have you fared here at the mission these few days since you've arrived?" continued Pastor Avery. "It's been lovely. Ashley has been with me most of the time, so I never felt out of place because of the new environment. We also handed out blankets yesterday and that was wonderful," replied Claire, her face beaming with joy as she said that. "I'm glad to hear that," said Pastor Avery with a smile on his face. Claire thought that he must have missed his home back in Ireland and asked about that. "When will you be returning to your home in Ireland? I'm sure your family misses you," asked Claire, fiddling with the roses in her hand. "Next year perhaps. I'll need to make a turn in Austria before I return to Ireland, so it would be by the end of next year." "Why are you asking?" replied Pastor Avery, still tapping the back of his Bible with his pen. "Just thought you'd want to get back to your wife," answered Claire, sure that he had a wife. Pastor Avery laughed once more, out of embarrassment perhaps. "I don't have a wife or child back home in Ireland, Miss Claire. I have devoted my life to the service of Christ and therefore have I foregone marriage and rearing children altogether," replied Pastor Avery. Claire had no idea that such a thing was done. She thought the duty of men and women in society was to marry and bear children. She thought that something must have been wrong with his reasoning. "Will you get married, at a later stage in your life?" asked Claire, still pondering what he had told her. "No, Miss Claire, I never plan to marry," replied Pastor Avery. Just then Claire thought of something else that had been on her mind. "I'd like to learn how to pray, Pastor Avery, could you teach me?" asked Claire. Pastor Avery looked at her a bit surprised by this and then replied, "Yes, I will." "Have you any idea of the matter?" replied Pastor Avery. "I have been taught it, but I would really like to know how to pray better, to pray with purpose and duty, not just out of habit," replied Claire. "It is important to pray out of habit as well, Miss Claire." "Well, praying with purpose would be praying for the sick, the poor, the broken-hearted and the forsaken. To pray out of duty would be to worship and sing praises to God in your prayers, for it is the duty of men to worship God. If you can turn these sorts of prayers into a perpetual habit, then you will be praying with purpose and duty," replied Pastor Avery, holding his Bible as he said that. Claire took that all in and thought about it for a while. They spent some time discussing prayer and fasting before Claire went inside to place the roses in 3 of the flower vases. Everything he had told her was very new to her and gave her a better understanding of Christianity. She was looking forward to hearing his sermon the following day. Then she thought of that, her first Sunday at the House of Christ Mission, what would service be like? Sunday morning came and Claire walked to the chapel with 4 other women as soon as she was dressed. It was a lovely green building with daisies blossoming in every flower bowl that decorated the entrance of the church. It was a wonderful sight, and 2 young girls with matching dresses would welcome each visitor and hand them a small cotton bag full of cookies. Claire noticed the joy of the people around her and believed this would be a joyful gathering. Once she got into the building, she found a place in the front right next to Ashley. "When did you get here?" asked Claire once she had sat down next to Ashley. "I got here before the service began. We were supposed to organize the building before the service, me and 4 other people," replied Ashley. "Oh, sorry for not helping. Look, here he comes," apologized Claire, and soon noticed Pastor Avery walking to the podium. The service had begun and they sang a few hymns. Then Pastor Avery opened his Bible for the morning's sermon. Claire was very excited to hear of what he had to say. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, I'm so glad to be here today. This morning I want to talk about fishing. Who in this congregation has been fishing in the past few weeks?" began Pastor Avery, and a few men raised their hands and some joked about the fish they had caught. Jesus calls us to be fishers of men, and I am here to expound to the congregation an additional meaning of the word fishing. In time of prayer I was led to examine a profound meaning behind each letter in the word fishing. Please grab a notebook and write down the conclusions I have come up with," said Pastor Avery, and cleared his throat to continue. "I would like for us all to go fishing. This is what I mean when I say that. Write the word fishing along the side of thy page in very large letters. Is everyone done? Right, near the F I would like for thee to write the words forgive and forget. It is important that we always remember to forgive those who wrong us and forget their trespasses against us so as not to lay it to their charge any longer. Next to the letter I would like for thee to write these words, immerse yourself in purity. Remove all impure items from thy body like tattoo drawings, makeup or adornments such as jewelry and hair wigs. Make thy temple pure before God that he may dwell therein. Next to the letter S, write seek deliverance diligently. Pray for the complete absolution of thy sins, always. Death is an uncertain thing, and therefore we need to seek deliverance from God very diligently and carefully. Next to the letter H, write have compassion. Give to the poor and pray for the sick. Let thy gentleness be known to all men as thou takest pity on the grieving. Next to the letter I, write the following words, impute to no man evil for evil. Resist the temptation to do unto others as they have done unto thee. Bless them that curse thee, and do good to those who mistreat thee and thy loved ones. Beside the letter N, write, never let a curse word come out of thy mouth. Never curse or look upon filth in the theater or media, and persistently teach others not to do such things. As humans we learn from what we see and hear, and therefore we need to examine very carefully the sources we learn from and not gaze upon impure acts in theater or read inappropriate literature in books. Next to the letter G, write these words, grudge not one against another. Do not meditate on the flaws and mistakes of others, and be very careful never to carry a grudge with you. We need to sincerely forgive our fellow man in order not to grudge against them. Pastor Avery looked up to the congregation from his notes and concluded. These are the laws, that if studied and rehearsed continually, thou shan't ever perish. Memorize them and carry them with thee wheresoever thou mayest venture, so that when people ask of thee what thou hast done with thy life, thou wilt tell them that thou had gone fishing with Jesus Christ. The end.